I'm Carla Kopp. I'm a game designer, publisher, and developer. And today we're here with Nick Yu. He runs Zucchini People Games, and he's designed Adventure Tactics, which is a massive, fantastic game, and also Eternal Dynasty and Hero Brigade.
And I do have a licensed game coming out later this year that I will be able to announce in May.
Okay, so
this is the announcement, the pre-announcement announcement.
Something exciting will happen in May.
Yeah, something exciting will
happen. Can you tell us more about yourself?
Yep. As Carla mentioned, I run Zucchini People Games. You can see my Twitter handle on the presentation. I won't bother spelling it, but you can see it. I've been doing game design off and on for eight-ish years. I took a break for the kids because my wife and I have 3 kids, so we need some time for that. But I've been heavily involved in game design. I also have a background, like I think a lot of people in game design, in math and computer science. So, Carla asked me to present some findings and some ideas regarding that topic. So this is a really big one too. I heard some people say they're not great with math, or they don't love math in the chat. So hopefully this will kind of talk about the idea in approachable ways. Yes, I mean, it's math, so there's going to be math involved. But hopefully you can get to the stage where you can at least understand the approach, even if you don't want to dive into the. So we're going to do a little bit of both.
Okay, and you have a slideshow.
I do have a slideshow. I do a lot of presentation at work, so I just instinctively build slideshows. But I mean, the topic is math and balancing. There's a couple of different ways that's going to affect your game balancing too. This is by no means an exhaustive list, right? But there are some questions you want to ask, like how long do you want your game to last? How frequently should something happen? Balancing for cost versus power, like a playing card, like Magic the Gathering type card, and how much should player skill shape the game? So these are just general balance considerations, and this is how math can or can't help you with those things. And I saw some of those questions. There were really great questions that you posted, Carla. So, in fact, even how frequently should something happen? I think that's one of those questions. So we're just going to do a quick hypothetical, right? We have a light game that should be 30 minutes playtime, right? And through your testing, you see that the winning player is going to get 1 victory point every 5th round. And in 2-player games, they take 1 minute, 1.5 minutes in a 3-player game, and 2 minutes in a 4-player game. So I did post the equations for those who want to go through it, but excuse me. So for your perfect 30-minute game, in a 2-player game, you're probably going to see 6 victory points as your victory condition. In a 3-player game, it might be 4, and 4 players, it's going to be 3. So again, that's if you want to stick to that 30-minute game. But 3 victory points might be really fast, right? That might be an engine building game where I just got my engine and the game's over already because we only played to 3 victory points. Whereas in a 2-player game, we're going to play for 6. So that might be one where you say, okay, well, let's play to 6. But that now in a 4-player game, that's really a 60-minute game now. And you see that happen in a lot of different games, right? Where for each player that you add, it adds that much more time. So that's where you can do the math. You can kind of do the napkin math and figure for 4 players, okay, well, I'm going to just say it's okay. Maybe 60 minutes is too long, so we'll settle for 4 or 5 EP. So it's not that brief and it's not too long. So those are the ways that math can help you balance game length when you have that kind of information. So whenever you're playtesting, make sure you're collecting data. Like if you have, let's say, I always use Magic the Gathering because it's a very familiar game to everybody. Just remember, like, who's winning in matchups. Like, does going first matter? Does going second matter? And what decks are people using? So just start collecting data when you're playtesting. Sometimes that pattern's not going to be apparent right away, but when you start collecting enough data, you'll see those patterns start to emerge. Like, okay, red is really strong this cycle. We need to be careful with that. So you won't have this information right away, but these are the things that you can start thinking about. The next big one was, how frequently should something happen? And in math, it's statistics probability, right? And this one I pulled from Dungeons and Dragons, which is very near and dear to my heart. But if you're not familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, or in order to do anything, you need to roll a d20, a 20-sided die, right? And then you have a specific target value to hit in combat. That's armor class, right? So on that 20-sided die, you need to hit at least 13, roll 13 or higher to hit the armor class. So I used any dice just to provide those nice visual representations. But let's say you don't have any modifiers, you're just rolling a straight d20, and the enemy has an armor class or AC of 13. That's only 40% chance that's going to happen. That's not super fun. I would say anything less than 50% chance, to address one of the questions, like how frequently should something happen. If that's your entire turn, if that's the only thing you're doing on your turn, like if you just move and attack, and then you only have 40% chance for that to happen, that's probably not a super fun experience for the player, right? But now, okay, well, I'm a fighter, right? I have a +3 chance to hit. So now that means you have 55% chance to hit that 13, and that's better. And D&D first level characters are actually going to have more like a 5, so that's an increased 10% or +6%. So you're going to have like a 65 to 70% chance to hit natively. So that's actually pretty good. But now you have other systems considerations like advantage, where it's 2d20, drop the lowest, and that actually even with that +3 chance to hit, that puts you in the 80% range. So that's just an interesting approach to math. Where 55, that's not great. Maybe that, like having a coin flip whether I do anything interesting on my turn is, even though rolling dice is fun, it feels bad to not do anything on your turn. It's okay to have those occasional misses because it makes it more cinematic and makes you more invested in the die roll. So like when you're in that 70%, 80% chance where you have a reasonable likelihood of success, that seems okay. And the other times, okay, well, the dice got me, right? And you can see the graph where this is just the black line is just the straight d20 roll. And then you can see how it jumps up, right? We give a +3 to hit, it jumps up. And then here's the very friendly curve if you have a advantage, which is rolling 2d20 and taking the best result. So that's just a very quick look at any dice. And any dice doesn't even have to just be dice. You can use it to program like decks of cards, any kind of interesting probability. And it's very simple scripting language. You don't need to have extensive programming experience to use it, but you can look at distribution graphs, you can export them. It's a very good tool, and I just put my sample equations there so you can see how I arrived at that with anydice.com. So if you want to figure out probabilities, Anydice is a great website. There's some Wolfram Alpha is another one. That one takes a little more getting into, but Anydice is great for game creators, and I would strongly recommend it if you haven't used that site before. Going back to Magic, my other classic example, you have cost versus power. When you're looking at balancing things, it's okay for some things to be more powerful than others and still be balanced, right? We have Ironclaw Orcs, which are like a pretty small 2/2 creature for 2 cost, right? Then you have your big Shivan Dragon, which is 6 mana, 5/5 flying, and you can pump its power. And those are both what I would consider balanced cards because their cost is so different. And the Shivan Dragon can be a game changer, like you can end the game. But by the time you're in the 6 mana range, the game should be coming close to having a victor anyway. So it's okay to have very different power levels in your game, and both cards still be balanced, right? You have your early threat, and then you have your big late game threat. So that's just another way you can use math to balance. And we can actually do, I think, a live exercise too after we get to everyone's questions. And this is a big one too. How much should player skill matter? It's the only thing that matters in games like chess and Go, right? You have perfect information. It's 2 players. There's no randomness. So skill is the only thing that matters. So that's where mathematical balance is really important because the only thing that's going to determine a victor is the skill of the players. For games like King of Token and Monopoly, where it's all about the dice, Monopoly's like, no, I don't choose to land on Boardwalk. I pay you. No, you just roll and move, right? You have to move there. And the first couple rounds around the table are the most important in Monopoly, right? If you land on those great properties and you have the ability to buy them early, you basically are going to end up winning an hour down the line, and an hour is probably being generous with Monopoly. And then you have games like, and I just picked classic examples, Settlers of Catan, Dominion, which luck is obviously important, for settlers. Do your resources come up? But Settlers actually did an interesting thing, which I think is friendly to new gamers, is the pips, and different editions of Settlers have different ways to represent it. But either the size of the numbers or the number of pips next to the numbers indicates how likely something's to come up, right? So you can make those informed decisions. Like if you put brick on a 12, you can't be sad when you roll 2d6 and your resource doesn't come up, right? If it's on 8 or 9, it doesn't come up that often, you have a right to be upset. That was unlikely, but still within the realm of probability, right? And same thing for Dominion. What cards are available in the initial tableau, what cards come up on your turn, and how other people play, those are outside of your control. But you can still craft your own deck. And it's your ability to analyze what's out there and build the best deck. That's within your control. So that's kind of in the middle. And one of the questions I saw was, how much does going first matter? And that's a big one in games like chess, right? Because the better player plays white. And we found out from AIs playing other AIs, that's actually a really huge difference between impossibly good players. But it doesn't matter as much between regular players. So when you find something like that, like first player has an advantage, you can definitely try to balance that, right? If your game has victory points, maybe if you go first, you just have -5. Right? That's something where we go back to the data collection from the beginning. If you have a bunch of data and you can say, okay, well, the first player generally wins by about 5 points every game, when that's their margin of victory, then okay, give them -5 BP to start if they go first. Or I'm sorry, go ahead.
How do you know what data to start recording?
I write down everything, anything that I think could be of interest to playing. Like for chess, I would record, who goes first, who goes last, and this is easy for chess because they have these things, right? And you can assign points per piece, right? How important is each piece relative to each other, and then how many points do people have left at the end of the game, right? How often do checks happen? How often do checkmates happen? And how often is it just a concession, right? And then what's the state of the board at that end? So, and I know that seems like a lot, but the more data that you get, the more informed your decision can be, right?
Yeah. How do you identify the difference between so you have all this data, and it could just be that green wins more often, but there's nothing about green that is different than blue.
Yeah, that's where you look at the player, right? Is Carla always green? Is she just better at this game? And that's something you should record too. Not just let's go back to Magic, right? I always play red deck, you always play blue deck, and you always win because you're better at Magic, right? It doesn't mean blue, the color blue is better than the color red. It's just that you're a better player and I'm making mistakes. So that's where it's important to observe the playtest. And also to understand the players. And you're not always going to know that, especially with a blind playtest. But hopefully before you go to the blind playtest, you'll have eliminated that. But that's a really great point. Sometimes you're not going to know. But you should try to find out.
So, if you don't know if there's different player counts, you just if there's different advantages, maybe there's a last player advantage. Do you just go through the data and just make sure that okay, well, do a percentage of the fourth player wins 1 in 4 times, so it's probably equal?
Yeah, I would check. Hopefully you have 100 playtests, right? Yeah, they don't have to be exactly 25% each, right? Because it's just never going to work out that cleanly. But it should be within that range, right? If I see 20%, it's probably okay, right? And you'd find out more with more playtests, but that wouldn't raise an eye. But if I see the fourth player is only winning 10% of the time, then I know there's a problem, and then they're at disadvantage. Or if they're winning 30, 35% of the time, that's way too often. So they're actually, because they can see the board develop or whatever, the last player actually has a significant advantage. If there isn't like a huge player skill disparity. So yes, if for multiplayer games, I think you should always record which player won, like first, second, third.
Mm-hmm. So when you're playtesting your games and like like all the numbers and like you've checked them and it's all balanced, but there's a perceived imbalance, what do you do?
Yeah, that was a tough question for me because my response is generally, oh, it's balanced. But if it doesn't pass what they call the eye test for people who watch the sports, sometimes it means that your equation is wrong. You're watching the wrong thing. To draw an example from basketball, they don't actually look at a player's top speed. That's actually a bad metric, right? The actual best metric for basketball is how quickly can a player accelerate and how quickly can they stop. Because basketball is played in spurts, right? It's not a sprint. It's not a marathon. You're running quickly and stopping, running quickly and stopping. For your question, maybe you're looking at the wrong thing. Maybe my quote unquote balance is making an incorrect assumption, or it could be perfectly balanced. But if every single person who plays this thinks it's imbalanced, it's something you should look at. And it maybe doesn't require a huge tweak, but you should definitely re-examine what you think is perfectly balanced if literally every single play tester says this is balanced, right? And that eye test, that perception, could be catching something you're missing, but it also could just be important to address because even if it behind the scenes you feel that it's balanced, or there's like a secret counter strategy out there that nobody's seeing, it's going to affect the perception of your game. People will say this is an imbalanced game; it's not fun, right?
Mm.
So you should. I think when you see that, you should always take a look. Take a second look. That's a great question, though.
There could be just like it could be that the card isn't clear or something like that. Like people just think that it does something else because the wording is odd, or I don't know. Like people think thoughts for a variety of reasons, and it's really hard to know all the time.
Yep.
So I think we talked about this a little earlier. Like, what percentage should you aim for if it should happen like most of the time?
Yeah, if you have a game that there's an element of dice in that without other players interfering, I would say at least 70%, right? 75, 80%. That range, that's like a pretty feel-good range where usually you're going to be doing something and it's not just outright failure. And any lower than 70%, there's going to be and there's other considerations like how many turns and how many actions do I have. If I only have one action and each turn lasts like an hour, the probability actually should be closer to 100%. Because I don't want to sit through, 4 other players for an hour and I did nothing on my turn. Like that's just a feel bad moment. But if let's say I have 2 actions on my turn and it's a pretty quick, snappy game, I would say 70% is fine because okay, well I missed that, but I have another chance to do something on my turn. And if both, bad luck, I rolled a natural one both times on my turn, it's not going to be that long before my turn comes around again. And then that will be just that. Remember that one time I rolled 2 ones. That'll just be a fun moment, right?
So, with the fun moments like that are rare, but they feel possible. Like, what percentage would you say that those are?
I would say less than 10%. And this is kind of like arbitrary percentages because I don't know the rest of the game. But that should be rare. That shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen every game. So 10% is probably even too high. It should be single digits. It shouldn't be something that happens every game, and it should be something that either that outstanding success or outstanding failure should be a rare, kind of cinematic moment. And you can even say, okay, well, this terrible thing happened for you, but you get a feel bad experience point, right? Or something to make up for it. So it's not a total loss on your turn. So you can even have a rule. Okay, if you fail both of your actions, then you get one imaginary dollar, one currency point. So it's not at least that wasn't a total loss, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always like when there's something.
Yeah.
So, other than Excel and anydice.com, like what other good tools do you tend to use?
Yeah, if you really want to get into the weeds, there's simulation software, and there's all manners of that. Whether you want to use some paid software or you have access to something in like R plus, R, or a programming language that you're familiar with, you can even write a simulation. And I know Senfeng Lim recently posted a link to an OpenAI, which is very primitive right now, but that could be very cool in the future. But it will basically simulate your game for you, so you can look for these trends that we're talking about. I think that's the future of game design. Uh, like we're definitely not there yet. That's a few years away, but that could be a very cool way to play test your game. Like let the AI do it for you.
Yeah. I mean, that would be nice just to be able to get like a whole bunch of data.
Yeah, like oh, I want 1,000 playtests. A few minutes
Mhm.
later, got it. Um, I think there's a risk that games become a little stale that way too, because sometimes imbalance can be fun, and that's a point where I should have put a slide for that too, where you can have like crazy broken combinations sometimes, and that's okay, right? Because that makes the game fun. Uh, One thing about using Excel, using spreadsheets, is players don't want to be playing a spreadsheet, otherwise they would all be accountants, right? And, no, not against accountants, because I have friends who are CPAs, but you don't want to feel like you're playing a spreadsheet. Uh, Master of Orion 2 is one of my favorite video games of all time. Master of Orion 3 comes out, and it feels like I'm playing a spreadsheet. Even had an autoplay your turn feature where I'm like, what am I even doing, right? Is my input even important? Because I'm playing a spreadsheet. So you want to have that, make sure there's at least a layer between the player and the math, right? There's some interactive element that doesn't make you feel like you're playing this perfectly balanced simulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd second that. Like, balance is good. Like, it should be pretty balanced, but like, you should also be able to do cool, like, weird things as well. Like, if the entire game is just like one note, that's not exciting.
Right. And there's also a difference between balance and perfectly symmetrical, right? And Root is one of my favorite recent games because it's balanced but completely asymmetrical. Like each player, each faction has a completely different role and approach to how to win the game, but they all share a board and interact with each other. So I think that's a great example of being balanced but not symmetrical.
Mm-hmm. When do you use math most in your design process? Is it like in the beginning, middle, or towards the end?
In the beginning, for sure. And I think we talked about this in a few other live chats, but I think the more that you do early, the stronger your foundation is, the less you have to do later on. But during testing, it's also very important too. And it doesn't have to be like math, but at least collect, as we talked about, collect the data so you can start looking for trends.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I would say early. Sorry, to answer your question, early is the most integral part. Tease math.
Um, how balanced should a game be before you open it up for play testing?
I think it's depends on the stage of playtesting. Like when you're just showing like your friends in informal play, it's okay for it to have like pretty broken element. Like you should be able to play through front to finish before you involve the public. But I think it's okay to have some unbalanced parts in it because at that point you're still looking for mechanics, right? You're still looking for does this engine even work before you should be balancing. And I think some people get ahead of themselves. Right? They're like, okay, my design's perfect, and I just want feedback on should this be +1 or +2. When you start showing the public a game, you should still be willing to change fundamental parts of your game if things don't work. And I know as designers and any kind of creative endeavor, really, you get really attached to your idea, right? It's your baby. You don't want to change it. But in the early stages, you should still be flexible about the design.
So, what about the designers that just hate math?
It's tough. I think it's okay for certain games. Like there are games where you don't really need we talked about those like King of Tokyo. It's okay. Actually, King of Tokyo actually has some math behind it between the dice and the abilities and the monsters. But that type of game, where it's not necessary. And I think some of the designers who say they hate math actually have a strong intuitive grasp of balance behind the scenes. They might not be able to express it, but they understand. You should at least be able to understand: is this balanced or not balanced, right? And if you don't want to do the pre-balancing ahead of time, then testing is going to be more important. Like you need to have a lot of play tests and collect a lot of data because you're going to need to fix it at that point if you didn't try to do that pre-balancing ahead of time. So I would say do more testing. If you hate math, do more testing. If you hate math and testing, I don't know what to.
Yeah, if you don't like, looking at spreadsheets or playing your game, then maybe don't be a game designer.
Right. No, that seems mean, but it's tougher to think about things in that regard, though. But I would say if you hate math and you don't want to look at any equations and set things up that way, just do a lot of testing because the wrinkles you'll be able to iron out the wrinkles that way.
Mm-hmm. So, do you use math in any other way when you're designing?
Those 4 questions I think are my principal ones. But there's so many ways to use math. Let's say you're designing a character, right? And we'll go back to Dungeons and Dragons for that example. You could either roll dice, right, to generate your character, or do a point buy system. And that's the kind of not new, but since 3rd edition, right, you use point buy, so all the characters are the same. Same allotment of points. So that way you're kind of encouraging balance. You don't have one player who's amazing and the other player who, has a 12 in strength and everything else is like a 9 and is basically terrible. And I've had those characters back in the old D&D days. So you can use just for setup, to answer your question, just to use setup, you can use math to balance. And a lot of those games, like battle arena games, a lot of games with miniatures and tactics games, you have that math in the very core of the design. So you have hit points. Each hit point is 1 point. Your plus to attack is 2 points, and then you just add them all up, and everyone should be around 100 points. Arbitrary example. So if you're thinking about it early, that's one of those ways that math can help you out. But you also have to do the testing because maybe that's a flawed assumption. Maybe hit points are actually the best thing in the game, and hit points should be worth 2 points in your world. And you can look at a game like HeroClix, where all the miniatures have very specific points, and you add them up, and that's your team, right? You need to have 200 points, and that's your HeroClix team. So obviously, there was a lot of math that went into, why is this, figure, 49 points, and this one is 112, right? And they have like these seemingly arbitrary values, but there was obviously a lot of math that went into, okay, this ability is worth this. This is how many clicks of health they have, and these are their powers, that kind of thing. So that's where math can be important.
Can you tell us about a time where you had one of those flawed assumptions where you thought that things were balanced, like it all made sense, but then going to play it just didn't?
Yeah, and I talked about this in my earlier game, Hero Brigade. There was a character who had 6 hit points, and that was the balanced approach. But there's a card that was supposed to counter them and does 5 hit points. So that character would still survive that card and was basically just an engine of destruction at 6 hit points, even though that was quote unquote balanced. So I actually lowered the hit points to 5 so that they could be disabled immediately by the counterplay card. And that's one of the things where you have to look at everything in the aggregate, and which I didn't. I'm just like, oh, okay, all these characters are perfectly balanced against each other, except this one character with that one extra hit point, which is way too good because they could survive an immediate counterplay and still go on to have a couple of turns. So that's one of those things which didn't come out until testing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you're just looking at characters and you're like, well, I put 10 points on everyone, so therefore it's all balanced, but it's how it interacts with everything else that actually says whether it's balanced or not.
Right, and it was okay for it to not be perfectly balanced afterwards because after making that adjustment through play, everything ended up being much better.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. But Nick, is there anything else you'd like to share about math and balancing?
No, I think to your main question, though, the people who don't like math, you don't have to love math. You just have to think about it, right? And there are all parts of the game design process that we don't love. But the earlier you can bring math into it to try to make some sense of the numbers that you're balancing, the better. And there are a lot of tools out there. Board Game Design Lab is a great website. Obviously, Kyle is a great resource, but sites like AnyDice, and even just playing around with Excel, playing around with spreadsheets, any simulation software like that. Again, that's deep end though. But if you have a programmer friend who is willing to do that for you, who really, really loves you apparently, is willing to program simulated outcome for you. I mean, those resources are out there though.
Do you have any good books or sites if people want to like know more about balancing or like attempting to balance their game?
I would say Board Game Design Lab is still probably, you'd have specific podcasts, specific episodes talk about game balance. Eric Lang has posted a lot of really interesting game balance. Also Daniel Solis. These are all kind of established veteran designers. They, on their blogs, they have good discussions about game balance too. So I definitely check those out.
Yeah, I did not know that Eric Lang had a blog.
He doesn't have a blog, but he's posted a lot of stuff on Twitter and through Board Game Geek. So you probably have to kind of go and try and find his wisdom. But he's a great Twitter follower. Great Twitter follow anyway.
Yeah, I would second that. He's amazing. In addition to being a great board game designer too.
Right.
So is there anything else that you're passionate about in board game design or publishing?
We covered some of the big ones. It's going to be a big year for Adventure Tactics, I hope. Last year was already a pretty good year for Adventure Tactics. I'm for an even better one this year. That's my big push right now. And to be announced project in May.
Mm-hmm.
But I love game design, and if you follow me on Twitter, that's probably the easiest way to reach me, like quickly to have notifications set on. So if you have any questions about math and how you can use math in your design, I'd certainly be willing to answer your question.
Okay. So is Twitter the only place that people should look for you, or should they look at other places too?
Yeah, we have a Facebook page for Adventure Tactics and Zucchini People Games, and Dan, obviously, Letterman Games. We have a Facebook group just for Adventure Tactics, which has been really active. I have an email address that I never check, so don't email me unless you want to get a reply a week later. I shouldn't say never, but I'm not in the habit of checking that email daily unless I know I'm expecting. So I would recommend Twitter or Facebook.
Okay.
The old people social media.
So at what point do you recommend people make a Facebook group for their game?
I think if you're going for Kickstarter, definitely. Unless you have like an established community already, like Weird Draft obviously has Discord and established social media pages. But if you think you're going to have a big hit, which everyone does, but usually you can kind of tell how a design's going to land after you start sharing initial feedback. For Adventure Tactics, Dan and I kind of had that inkling pretty early on. Like even before the Kickstarter, we were at cons showing off the design, and we got that feeling of like buzz. So we're like, okay, we need to kind of get ahead of this. So even before we didn't, the page was created. It wasn't live until the Kickstarter launched, and then we were like, okay, yeah, there's a big community. Let's turn that Facebook page on, start linking it. So I would have it ready. You don't have to use it, but it certainly doesn't hurt. It takes a minute to create a page.
Mm-hmm.
So for those kind of things, but just always be prepared, I guess.
We all want to like have our game blow up, so
yeah.
If you're prepared, then you have everything going on.
Yeah, always prepare for success, right? Expect failure,
mm-hmm.
Prepare for success, right?
So I think Maddie has one last question, but we'll give her time to try to word it. Oh, okay. Go on.
All right. So how do you deal with like the more complicated quantum mechanics in probability? Because like I have a game, for instance, that every player has a chance to trade a card with a dead hand.
Okay.
And each time around the table, it gets technically, if you're going by a pure math standpoint, the
Right.
last player around the table has the worst chance of getting the card they want out of the dead hand.
Mhm.
But in my game, I got around that by you don't reveal the card you took out until everybody's made the choice.
Mhm.
So from like a more quantum mechanic standpoint, the probability hasn't changed because nobody
Right.
knows what the probability is. But I still get some complaints that it's not great to be the last player in
The-
that.
Does the first person in each round change, or is
Yeah.
it always?
Every player has a chance to be first player.
And is there an even number of rounds for all players?
Yes.
I would say that's okay then, because although it's worse for that round, you have an equal amount of bad quote unquote bad rounds, right? Where you're the last player, and that's where it can get very tricky. And that's where I would say it's okay not to be 100% mathematically balanced, as long as people understand you all have a time where you're last, an equal amount of times that you're last, or you have the worst position, right? The only thing I would keep in mind is if you look at, who goes first in the first round, do they have a higher probability of winning the game overall? In that case, you may want to take a closer look. But I wouldn't worry about, as you said, keeping track, because then that's where I think you're kind of over focusing on math. And I know we just had a 30-minute talk where we're just talking about math, but you don't want the math to dictate the design 100% either. But I mean, that's a great question and a great example. Mine would my way of going about that would be address, okay, everyone has an equal amount of times as the last player, so you all have that bad chance. But then I would also look at the testing to make sure that people who go first in the first round don't have an inordinately high number of wins. If that helps. Which you probably already considered.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, any last words, Nick?
I don't think so. I was going to do a live balancing, but I don't think that's necessary for this crowd. I think we talked through everything pretty thoroughly, and I'll make the slides available so people can take a look, and some of the links that I mentioned, and I'll try to find some of those design discussions from our balance discussions from Eric Lang.
Mm-hmm.
So post them in the chat.
That would be amazing. So thank you all for watching. If you want to join the discussion, go to weirddraftgames.com/discord. I hope everyone has a great weekend.
All right,
See you
thank
all
you.
later.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.